And in here we're going to be looking at numbers today. It's not math class. The book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Bible. And I don't know, I'm trying to look into your faces and see if I have any piercing glares at me, since our class is not part of the February Foodies promotion. I don't know, I'm seeing grins, so I think I'm okay. But I did think about it, but it just seemed like when I heard about it, there wasn't enough time for me to wrap my head around it and how we would do it. But I will say this, if we do something like that, it's not going to be on attendance, it's going to be on verse memory. We got a Bible verse each week, and we're not very enthusiastic about quoting or even reading that verse when it's our chance. So I have to say this myself. I have my own plan and of what I'm doing, and if I don't think about, and I haven't, but this would get me going, incorporating this into there, I'm not going to memorize this verse. Most of them I kind of know, so I can fake it maybe. Sit there on the front row and say 95% of the words correct because I'm not in front of you, like Dr. Swangam could say 95% of it correct unless he's in front of us. I understand that. But anyway, so we are not doing that right now, but the next time there is a promotion, if I get enough time, I just have to think, how are we going to do that? You know, we got to have some helpers. If you'd be willing to help the next time that comes around, I can call your name off, say, when you come in, see so-and-so, and quote the verse to them, something like that. But any kind of promotion or contest we would have, the next one, at least, would have to do with our verse memory. So, anyway, but you're off the hook right now. You just can't come to the March Foodie celebration of the February Foodies month. The book of Numbers. Now, we've been, since the first of the year, taking what I'm calling a survey of the Bible. And in a certain sense, it almost, in almost in a derogatory sense, it seems like it's just like Sunday school material. Okay, I'm saying that on purpose because it just seems kind of light compared to what we normally do in here. But at the same time, it is very useful. I have learned a lot by looking at these resources. You know, I like to spend a lot of time digging into verses and paragraphs and stuff like that. But stepping back and getting the overall picture is really, really helpful. And I've enjoyed so far the study of it, and I hope that you are, and I hope that it's a help to you. I know, especially these last week and this week, these books of the Bible, Leviticus and Numbers, man, when I see that in the list, I'm thinking, wow, it's going to be a long read this morning. Is that sinful to say that? I'm confessing. It's just Numbers. It just doesn't sound exciting at all. It's just those lists of names and people and numbers of this tribe, and there was 50,000 of that tribe, and 48,500 of that tribe, and 62,000 of this tribe. And you think, why is that even in the Bible? But it's there, okay? And there's reasons for that. We probably won't go into the reasons for why they're there. But I like this. This has helped me to see the overall theme of the book and how the big picture of the book fits together, and then how it fits into what God is telling us through Scriptures has been very enjoyable. And I hope that it is helpful, enjoyable for you, and even if it's not enjoyable, that it's helpful. So, Numbers. The book of Numbers, of course, has its name derived from the numberings of Israel that are in here. And if one wasn't enough, there's two. There's one at the beginning of the book where it numbers all the children of Israel. And then we get to the end of the book, and there's another set of numbers, right? There's another census. So the numbers is the numbering of the people. It's a census, like how many were in each tribe. And there's one in the beginning and one at the end. It's interesting that the kings of Israel were told not to number the people of Israel, and that would be because a king would number his people to estimate how strong he was, how great of a king he was, and then he would begin to depend on the strength of his numbers rather than depending on the protection of God. So the kings were told not to number. Remember David. He sinned greatly by numbering the people and all that. But here, God had commanded and said he wanted the people numbered, and then they numbered them again. So, but the Hebrew name is called in the wilderness. And if we think about it, and as we go through it, you're going to see there's a lot of events that happen between those numberings, and they all happen in the wilderness. So the Hebrew name for the book is in the wilderness. And what we have is, well, let's just continue. We'll get to that. The author is Moses. The book doesn't say Moses wrote this, but it's commonly accepted that it's Moses. It's the fourth of the 5 books of Moses. No one except really bad modernists dispute whether Moses wrote this. There's, of course, the JEDP and QRSTUV theories of authorship, but most people, and we do, believe Moses wrote these books and this one. So there's a lesson that we get through it, and I'm going to repeat the lesson in different words at the end because I want to bring it to us a little bit better. But one of the central lessons is that unbelief bars enjoyment of God's promises. Unbelief bars enjoyment of God's promises. In Numbers, there are 7 murmurings. Now, they complained in Exodus, but we have 7 murmurings in Numbers. We're not going to look at each one, but I'm going to mention them. The first, sorry, I'm going to sneeze in the microphone. That's awful. They murmur concerning the way. They complained about the way that they were going. Then they complained about the food. And that's when God provides the quail for them. Then they murmured about the giants in the land that they were going to go. Then there was complaining about the leaders, complaining about Moses. And then there was complaining about God's judgments. And then there was some complaining about the desert, and another complaining about the manna, a second complaining about the food. So 7 different events that are told to us, 7 different times when they murmured, and their murmuring was enough to be noticed by God and Scripture. Also, in Numbers, we see 3 messianic types. And a type is something that's in the Old Testament that pictures, that the New Testament says pictures Christ. Now, a lot of times we can see things that are kind of pictures of Christ, but if the New Testament doesn't say it, it's not a type. That's an academic theological word, a type. So a type is something that the New Testament, that's in the Old Testament, and the New Testament says is about Christ. And so we have the smitten rock. This rock was Jesus, right? So the rock smitten in chapter 20, and 1 Corinthians chapter 10 tells us that rock was Jesus. Then there's the brazen serpent, even as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. So Jesus himself says that was a type of him, right? That's John 3:14, and then we have 15 and 16 there. And then there's the cities of refuge. There's instruction at the end of Numbers that they're to designate certain towns in their land as cities of refuge, and that is a type of Christ seen in Hebrews chapter 6. And verse 18. So there's these messianic types or types of Christ that are in Numbers. Numbers, between the numberings, has a lot of events in it that are used, again, as examples in Scripture also. The prophets reminded the people of Israel of the events of Numbers. In Isaiah chapter 63, Isaiah reminds his people, his generation, about what happened in the wilderness. Jeremiah chapter 7, he reminds them. Ezekiel chapter 20 refers to the book of Numbers. The poets, David and Asaph and the other poets in the Psalms, Psalm 78, Psalm 95, Psalm 106, they refer back to events that happen in the book of Numbers. And then the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10. Now, I mentioned 10:4, but there's a lengthier discussion that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 10, referring to what the children of Israel did and how God responded to them in the book of Numbers. And then Hebrews 4 and 5 also looks back at the book of Numbers. So there's just some big picture things about the book. And now let's just get an overview of what is happening in the book of Numbers. And in order to do that now, we have to have a little bit of a setting. We remember God's creation of the world. God dealt with mankind at the beginning of Genesis, and mankind blew it over and over and over and over again. And so God decides, and when we say God decides, we're kind of putting our nature onto God. God decided all this. God has always had it decided. We don't understand God, right? When did God decide? Well, we see that God decided it in Genesis chapter 12. But God, these plans are His from eternity. He's eternal. We can't comprehend it. But forgive my humanization of God. God decides that He's going to, He promised He was going to redeem mankind in Genesis chapter 3, and He decides that He's going to do that through the family of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And so the rest of Genesis, we have God's dealings and the story of Abraham's family and his children, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And so God had promised He would bless Abraham and that He would give him and his family a land. But at the end of Genesis, the people are not in the land that God sent Abraham to. They're in Egypt. And so Exodus tells us the story of the people, God's people, the Israelite, the Hebrew people, how they left Egypt. And so they made an exodus out of Egypt. And in Exodus, they end up at Mount Sinai. And God enters into a covenant with the people of Israel there. The people of Israel agree to the covenant. So they say, yes, we will be your people. And then we know, not very long after that, they break the covenant. They create a golden calf. They worship false gods there. And then God sets up, but God forgives them. Really, He's faithful to His promise. And in Exodus, at the end of Exodus, they're setting up a tabernacle so that God would be able to dwell in the middle of His people. God's on the mountain away from the people, but He wants to be in the midst of His people, and so He tells them how to make a tent and all the different furniture of the tent and the curtain around it, a space, so that God could be there, His presence could be in the midst of His people. And then we get into, and at the end of Exodus, it's all set up, but Moses can't even go into the presence of God, right? And in last week we saw in Leviticus how we have these different ways for the people of Israel to be able to enter the presence of God. There was rituals, there was priests, there were, and now I forgot the other one. I'm such a good teacher, I can't even remember my lesson. Sacrifices, those are the rituals. Oh, and then there's purity. There was ritual purity and moral purity. And then in the midst, in thought process of the book of Leviticus is the Day of Atonement. So with the sacrifices and all these things, the people of Israel could be represented in the presence of God. Not everyone could go in the presence of God. Moses can go into the presence of God. Aaron, once a year on the Day of Atonement, can enter the presence of God. And so we have the tabernacle built in the end of Exodus, and then how to get into the presence of God temporarily in the book of Leviticus. And so now everything is set. The people of Israel are all set. They have entered into covenant with God. God is in their presence, and they can enter into God's presence. And it's time. They've been here at Sinai for about a year, and now it's time to continue on their journey. They left Exodus to go to Canaan, and so it's time to go. And so we see, so we have the book of Numbers. Numbers is divided into 5 sections. Basically, the people of Israel are in 3 places generally in the book of Numbers, and there's 2 sets of travels between those 3 places. They begin at Sinai, and they're at Mount Sinai for the first 10 chapters of Numbers, and then they travel for a couple chapters, and they end up in the wilderness of Paran, P-A-R-A-N. They're in the wilderness of Paran, and then they travel for a couple chapters, and they end the book of Numbers in the plains of Moab. So Sinai is, if you're thinking it's south on the Sinai Peninsula. We expect, there's arguments about where Mount Sinai is, but it's south in the wilderness, and let's just say it's on the Sinai Peninsula. And they finish there, and they travel up to the wilderness of Paran, which is immediately south of the land of Israel. They came up to Kadesh Barnea, they travel there, and they're there, and events happen there on the southern, it wasn't a border at that time, obviously, but on the southern edge, the southern border of the land of Canaan, and it's there that they are prepared to enter Canaan. And as we know, they decide they don't want to go into Canaan, and then God says, okay, that's fine, you won't go. And then they wander around, and they end the book in the plains of Moab, which is directly east. Is that right, my brain? Yes, east of the promised land, with the Jordan River between them and the land of Canaan. So that's the big picture, and let's get into that. At Mount Sinai, in chapters 1 through 10, basically the first thing that we see in the book is the census, or the numbering of the people. We go through and we number each of the tribes of Israel, and along with, that's like this first 4 chapters or so, along with the numbering of that, or after the numbering of the people, we have instructions about the arrangement of their camp. God is a God of order. He wants to know how many, and he says where they should be. And so we're getting this instruction about when they are camping, and as it turns out, they're going to do this for 40 years. But when they're in camp, not traveling, but when they're in camp, the tabernacle is right in the middle, right? God's in the middle of his people. And around the tabernacle are 4 groups of people, the priesthood, and then the 3 other sons of Levi. Kohathites, anyway. There's 3 other, they have different responsibilities in the carrying of the tabernacle, all that, and they have particular places where their tents, their dwelling places would be. And so between, and then outside of them, on each of the 4 sides of the tabernacle, are 3 tribes. There's a group of tribes represented by Joseph's children. Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin are on one side. There's a group of tribes led by Judah. There's a group of tribes led by Reuben. And then I believe it's a group of tribes led by Dan. But there's 3 on each of the 4 sides. But between the people and the presence of God is the family of Levi, the priest and the other families. So we have this arrangement of the camp. And then we have instructions on how they're to move. God says when the cloud of his presence rises off the tabernacle, they are to go into motion. And he gives the order of who goes into the tabernacle and who does this and who takes what parts and all of this. And the Ark of the Covenant leads the people, but then there is the order of which tribes will go first. Judah leads, and then there's a group of Levites with certain parts of the tabernacle, and then another tribe, and then another set of Levites, and it's all orderly. There's an order for all this. So God sets this arrangement of the camp and the order of marching. That's in the first 4-5 chapters. And then in the next 5 chapters, there are more laws about keeping their camp pure. Now, we had laws about their life and how purity laws about ritual purity and moral purity in order to come into the presence of God. But it just seems that since we're talking about God dwelling in the midst of their camp, he adds more laws, more instructions about how they lived among one another. There's ritual purity laws that are expanded, and maybe not all, but very much connected with the idea of living in camp. And so, because if God's going to live in your presence, you want to have your camp in your camp. You want your camp to be as pure as possible for him. So that's chapters 1 through the beginning of chapter 10. Then the end of chapter 10 and then 11 and 12 is a series of traveling. So they're all, we might say, excited. We're all set. We're ready to go. We're heading to the promised land. We're marching to Zion, maybe, whatever you want to say. They're ready to go. And they head out on their travels, and what happens? The very first thing, they complain. They're complaining about the food. They're complaining about the water. It'd be better for us if we were back in Egypt, where there were leeks and onions, or leeks and garlic, or whatever. You remember that phrase is right there. So they're complaining there. They're complaining about God's provisions for them, and God deals with that. And then in chapter 11, even, it gets, if it could, I would say it gets worse. Miriam and Aaron complain about Moses in front of all the people. They're like, what makes him so special? And so there's the event, the incident, we would say, of Aaron and Miriam complaining about Moses. You remember Miriam is struck with leprosy, and the whole camp of Israel have to sit still for a week while she goes through the purification process of somebody that's been cleansed of the leprosy. But there's the travels there, they're complaining, and they're complaining. Murmuring is the word. And then they end up in the wilderness of Paran. So they're down in Sinai, and they travel up to Paran, which is immediately south of the promised land. And there, God tells Moses to send spies into the land. How many spies went into Canaan? Right? 12 men went to Canaan. 10 were bad and 2 were good. So the spies are sent to explore the promised land. Now, I'd like you to turn to Numbers chapter 13. And I'm just always fascinated with the precision of the scriptures. Numbers chapter 13, we'll look at verse 26. You might be confused by this, but I just want us to point something out in being careful when you're reading the scripture or when you're studying the scriptures. Numbers 13, verse 26. And they went and came to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel unto the wilderness of Paran, to Kadesh, and brought back word unto them and unto all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. Okay, so it says they come back to everybody, right? And then verse 27 says, and they told him and said, we came unto the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. And Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, we be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it, it is a land that eats up the inhabitants thereof. And all the people that we saw in it are men of a great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in their own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Now, I've always, for a while there, I wondered, how do they do this? They're bringing back a report. They bring back a report that's good, and then immediately they bring back a report that's bad. You notice that? He says, their report, they say to the children of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. What does that mean? That means it's a bad land. It's awful. You go into this land and there's just nothing there. In fact, there's so little there it's going to eat you up. There's nothing there for you to eat. It's a bad, horrible land. So what happened here? Notice the precision of Scripture. In verse 26 is a summary of what happened. In verse 26, he says, they went and came to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel unto the wilderness of Paran. They came back to Paran, to Kadesh, and brought back word unto them and unto all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. Okay? So they came back. This is a summary statement. The next verse changes the audience of the words. Notice that. And they told him and said. So now who are they talking to? Moses. Okay? So this first sentence is a summary. This is what we're going to be telling you about. The second sentence, verse 27, is the first actual event that's inside this first sentence. They talked to Moses. And before Moses, they said, it's just like you said. It's a land full of milk and honey. It's a tremendous land. Look at the fruit, all of this, but the giants are there. And Caleb says, we don't care about giants. God is our helper, right? So this happens in front of Moses. And then, verse 32. So in verse 31, they respond to Caleb and say, but the men that went up with him said, we're not able. And then verse 32, and they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying. Okay, so to Moses they said, it's just like you said, it's flowing with milk and honey. But when it came time to talk to the people, because they didn't want to go there, because they said there's no way God can do this, because there's giants in the land, they said, it's an awful land. It's way better even to be in Egypt. If we go into this land, there's not going to be anything that we can do. The land is going to eat us up. Okay? So there, to me, and maybe you're not like me, but I read, it's a good land, it's a bad land. How did they do that? How did they stand up in front of the people and say it's a good land, and then a little bit later say it's a bad land? Well, it didn't. They said, to Moses, to him, they said, it's a good land, but there's giants. To the people, they said, it's a bad land, and there's giants. Okay? So there's no contradiction in this passage, and I don't know that any of you would have seen it, but maybe you have. But I think that's really neat to see that the Bible is very accurate in what it says. Anyway, so this happens, and what does God say? Fine, you're not going to go. And then they say, oh, but we want to go, and right? And then they charge up the hill, and they're killed. Several of them are killed. They say, well, then, fine, we're going to just get ourselves our own leader and go back to Egypt. God does not allow them to do that. And he says, okay, you're going to get your way. You're not going in the land. And the children that you thought were going to be killed by the giants, they're the ones that are going into the land. You're going to wander for 40 years. 1 year for each day that you viewed the land. And so we have this, and you would think that they would learn their lesson. But right after that, chapters 16 and 17, what do we have? The rebellion of Korah. Korah rises up in rebellion against Aaron and says, you take too much upon you. We're Levites just like the rest of you. We should be able to do this. And what? Sorry. And so there's the rebellion of Korah. And so, and that's, and you remember that story. God, they bring the 12 rods, the staffs that represent the children of Israel. Aaron's rod buds, and then Moses says, this is awful, and to prove it's awful, God, these men are not going to die a normal death. They're going to die because the earth is going to open and swallow them up, and the earth does open and swallow them up. So that's the time in the wilderness of Paran. And then there's not much time given to it, but they begin their wanderings. And they wander, and they wander. But we have basically two events in chapters 20 and 21 that happened during their travels, during their wandering. And the first is the people complain again about not having water. They complain again about not having water, and Moses also rebels, right? God says, go speak to the rock. He had already smitten the rock back the first time that it drew water out of the rock, I think in Exodus. God says, speak to the rock. Moses goes and says, do we have to get water for you? He places himself on the level with God, and that's rebellion. He strikes the rock, strikes it again, and water does come out. But God says, you misrepresented me, and you now will not go into the land. So the people can't go in the land. They rebelled. Moses rebels, and he can't go into the land. And then, again, what the very next chapter, now this the book of Numbers does cover like 38 years, so it might not have been the next day. But the Bible represents it to us. The very next thing, what are they doing? They're complaining. They're murmuring again. And this is when God sends the fiery serpents, the deadly snakes after them. They bite them, and people are dying. And what does God tell them to do? He says, fashion a brazen serpent, put it on a pole, and raise it up, and those that look will live. Nehushta, I think, is the name of that brazen serpent. But so we have that event happening there in chapter 21, and then they arrive in the plains of Moab. So they're wandering around, and they end up at the end of their wanderings on the east of the promised land with the Jordan River between them. They arrive in the plains of Moab, and the king of Moab is very upset. Here's a giant group of people that he says is numberless. They spread as far as the eye can be seen, and he says, I don't want these people around. We need to do something about this. So he sends messengers off to Mesopotamia, where there's a very well-known prophet, probably a pagan sorcerer, okay, named Balaam. Balaam is a kind of confusing situation. He's in Mesopotamia. Maybe he's not a pagan sorcerer. Maybe he's just a backslidden whatever. But God interacts with Balaam. And it is God that interacts with him. But we have the story of Balaam and Balak, the king of Moab. Eventually, Balaam comes, and the king of Moab wants Balaam to curse these people. And Balaam decides he's going to pray to the Hebrew God, which, if he's pagan, that makes sense. Might as well, get that people's God to curse them. Every other people's God would curse their people. All the other pagan gods, they're always, you can just do something and get them mad at their people. Okay? So why wouldn't the Hebrews' God be the same way? So, there's just different thoughts there. Balaam is not, I don't have all the answers on Balaam. But either way, Balaam gets a vision, and what does he do? He blesses the people. Of course, God said, he's going to bless these people, those that they're going to be his blessed people. And 3 times that happens. Balak says, curse Israel for me. Balaam says, how can I curse that who God has blessed? And the 3rd time, he's in the middle of pronouncing this blessing on the people, and Balak just jumps up and says, stop, whatever. And he stops, but then Balaam continues, and in this continuation, he prophesies, and this is where it's kind of, God will use whoever he wants to. He prophesies that a scepter will rise, or there shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Balaam prophesies the coming of the prince, the coming of the Messiah. And so we have here again a reminder of the promise that God had made to Jacob and that Jacob pronounced on Judah in Genesis 49. So, and all this kind of just shows in a stark way a very big lesson about God in Numbers. Here, down in the valley, in the plains of Moab, are the people. And what are they doing? They're murmuring. They're complaining. I wish we were back in Egypt. Where's the water? Where's the food? What is this manna? And we've been eating this what is it, for 40 years. What is this? And I'm tired of it. I want something else. I've used every variation of recipes I can think of to do with this manna. They're complaining, right? They're down in the valley complaining about God, and unbeknownst to them, there's a king and a prophet up on the mountain looking over top of them from different vantage points, trying to curse them, and God is protecting them. God's faithful to his promise. And they don't even know it. They're complaining in the valley, and God is protecting them on the hilltops. We're really going fast. There's other things that happen through here. There's Balaam gives advice to Balak, and the daughters of Moab intermarry with the children of Israel, and there's God's judgment in that situation. But toward the end of the book, the children now of the first generation prepare to enter the promised land. There's another census. There's a second numbering. So the second numbering, there's nobody alive numbered the second time that was numbered the first time, except, right, Joshua and Caleb. Now I would assume they're families, okay? But the numberings are just men. So Joshua and Caleb, Moses, are the only ones numbered in the second one. All the rest died in the wilderness. Actually, I got curious about this once. That's a high death rate. Let's put it that way. It's not astronomically high, though. If you just look at death rates, average death rates, and then apply that to the numbers and the days, 38 years, it's not astronomically high, but it is higher than average. So there's a lot of people, a lot of funerals, as they would say here. More than normal, but not astronomical, except for when there's 20,000 killed in one day. But anyway, so there's the second numbering. They also have some military victories. They conquer Og. Is it Og? King of Bashan or whatever. These were giants on this side. These men were giants. They conquered their lands. And 2.5 of the tribes settle in to the land on the other side of Jordan. And they asked to stay there. And there's the interaction between Moses and them. And they promise that the men, will leave their herds and their families behind and march before the children of Israel with them into the promised land and fight with them until everyone has rest in their homes. And so, the book of Numbers, we have it's the end. Moses has done the last administrative thing he needs to do. All he's going to do is give them one last long talk, and God's going to call him up into the mountains, and he's going to die and be buried, and the children of Israel will enter the land of Canaan. That last long talk is the book of Deuteronomy, which we'll overview next week. But the lesson from Numbers is that God brings judgment and shows mercy throughout it. The people murmur, they complain, they do things they ought not do, but God has made promises to them, and He is faithful to His promises. He brings judgment on them when they are disobedient, but He has mercy on them. And this is especially highlighted in the plains of Moab. They're complaining in the valley, and God is protecting them in the mountaintops. God is faithful to His promises, but He lets His people walk away and face the consequences. And that's something that still applies to us today. It's in God's character. He's faithful, but He will allow us to He's not going to just box us in and not let us do what we want. Not that we should want to do anything other than what God wants. But when our wanter goes astray, He lets us go, and then He uses that to teach us, and He will punish us when we will face the consequences. All right.